Very good evening to one and all. This class is for class 9th standard and the chapter today is pollination and fertilization. So what is pollination? Today we will deal about pollination. So what is pollination? Pollination means transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the flower. Either by any means, either by wind or by insect or by water, whatever it is, or by water, whatever it is, or by birds, whatever it is. Just pollination means transference of pollen grain from anther to the stigma of the flower. Now, in pollination, why pollination is necessary? Because of pollination we are getting seeds, because of pollination we are getting fruits, because of pollination only the whole life cycle of the botanical part goes on, and which is having a direct influence on the zoological part also. If there is no proper fruit or no proper seeds, then what about the herbivores, how they will lead their life? And if there is no herbivores, how the carnivores or the omnivores will survive? So ultimately it is maintaining our whole life cycle. So today we will see there are two types of pollination, namely self-pollination and cross-pollination. So what is self-pollination? The transfer of pollen grain from anther to the stigma of the same flower, or from the anther to the stigma of the different flower of the same plant. That is self-pollination. Under self-pollination, we will see today what are the conditions need to maintain self-pollination, what are its advantages and disadvantages. Now, starting from the first, self-pollination means transference of pollen grain from anther to the stigma of the same flower, or from the anther to the stigma of the different flower of the same plant. Means in the same plant only the transference of the pollen grain will be occurring. Now, the conditions for self-pollination are the flower must be bisexual. Means the anther as well as the stigma both must be in the flower. Means the androecium part, that is the male part, and the gynoecium part, that is the female part, both must be there in the flower. Apart from that, the maturity of androecium and gynoecium must be in proper time. It doesn't mean that androecium is maturing now and gynoecium is maturing a lot of days, after a lot of days. So the pollination won't be happening there at that time. So flower must be bisexual, means androecium and gynoecium, both the organs, both the sex organs must be there in a particular flower. And if a flower is unisexual, means let's say the flower is male or female, but its partner, if the flower is male, its female partner must be in the same plant. Or if the flower is female, its male partner must be in the same plant. And the maturing time of the androecium and the gynoecium must be proper, must be quite at the same time itself. The maturation must be takes place at the same time. Now, having said till here, these are the conditions. Some flowers like cleistogamous flower. Cleistogamous flower means the flower which are not opening, which are not at all opening properly. Those flowers, they are having anther and stigma both inside, and their maturation time is also more or less same. So it will support self-pollination. Now, apart from that, today we will also see these are the conditions of self-pollination. Now, what are the advantage of self-pollination? The advantage of self-pollination is no bulk pollen grains are required. Means pollen grains should not be produced at a bulk, at a huge quantity. The purity of the race means the parents are pure. There is no mixing of parents. There is no mixing up of genes of the parents. The character will be restored. Then the maturing time of the female and the male reproductive part will be quite similar maturing time. So these are the advantages of the self-pollination. The seeds will be, whatever the seeds we will be getting will be of pure quality, because the same plants is pollinating, same flower is pollinating, or different flowers of the same plant is pollinating. Means there will be no mixing up of the parents. Now, means the genes of the parents won't be mixed up. That is the advantage. Now, what is the disadvantage of this? What is the disadvantage of the self-pollination? The disadvantage is if the parents are defective, maybe the defective character of that parents will also transfer to its progeny. So the progeny or the offspring or the young one of that parent will not be surviving for a longer time. Secondly, the flowers of the self-pollinations are not that much attractive or having good amount of nectar in it. Thirdly, the self-pollination, whenever it is occurring, though it is not producing more amount of pollen grain, but the quality of the seeds and the fruit after certain period of time of self-pollination will become very much weaker. Means we will not get a very good quality of seeds or fruit. So this is what about the self-pollination's conditions, advantages and disadvantages. Now we will go to cross-pollination. Cross-pollination. What is cross-pollination? Cross-pollination means transfer of pollen grain from anther to the stigma of the different flower of the different plant. Flower will also be different, plant will also be different. I hope you can understand this. So, transfer of pollen grain from anther to the stigma of the different flower of the different plant. Flower is also different, plant is also different. Now, what are its condition? Cross-pollination is also called as allogamy. Why? Because parents are completely different. So species will be same. Means if rose flower is producing pollen, and that pollen, if at all it is dusted on the female sunflower or female jasmine, then pollination won't be occurring. But if black rose pollen grain is going to the red rose pollen grain, or else if red rose pollen grain is going to the pink rose pollen grain, then of course that is a case of cross pollination, because parents are different. Species is same, but parents are different. Now, what are the conditions of a cross pollination? First condition is unisexuality. Unisexuality means that only single sex. In a particular plant, all the flower will be either male or female. Means there is no chance of self-pollination. In a particular plant, either male or female, all flower will be either male or female. There is no chance of self-pollination. Next one is self-sterility condition. Self-sterility. What is self-sterility? If the flower is bisexual also, and the flower is having the organ anther as well as a stigma, the anther is producing the pollen grain, but the stigma cannot fertilize it. Means in the stigma, the pollen grain cannot fertilize. That is known as self-sterility. Those flowers will be considered as self-sterility. Though they are bisexual flowers, but somewhere or the other, either the anther will not produce pollen grain, or if anther is produced, then stigma will not accept that pollen grain for the process of fertilization. This is known as self-sterility. Next one is the dichogamy. Dichogamy means two cases are there under dichogamy: protogamy and protandry. Protogamy means the female part of the flower will mature faster than the male. So if the female is mature faster, it will grow older and it will not accept the pollen from the male. Two cases are there. First of all, protogamy, where the female will mature faster than the male. Means female part of the flower will become more mature than the male part of the flower. And here what will happen, if the male is producing the pollen grain also, now the female become too old to receive the pollen grain for fertilization. And another condition is protandry, under this dichogamy only. In protandry, what happens, the anther of the flower will mature faster. Means the androecium part male part will mature faster. Means pollen grain will be produced, but the female part is not mature enough to receive those pollen grain. So fertilization won't be done. So what we learned? We learned about unisexuality, we learned about self-sterility, we learned about dichogamy. Under dichogamy, two conditions were there: protogamy and protandry. Now next is the heterostyle. What happens in heterostyle? Heterostyle means the female part either will become very much smaller or it will become very much longer than the male part. Means they both will be not at all compatible to each other to receive the pollen grain. Though the anther is ready with its pollen grain, but due to its extremely less size or extremely more size, it is not at all parallel to the anthers, so that the anther could give the pollen grain to the stigma. So that is what happens in the heterostyle. Either the female part will become too long or it will become too short, so that it should not be compatible with the anther to receive the pollen grain. So this is the condition of the cross-pollination. Last one is the hercogamy. In hercogamy, what happens? No, the flower itself making its own physical barrier. The flower itself is making its own physical barrier. Now this physical barrier of the flower is very much effective. Means it will not allow, though the flower is bisexual, but the physical barrier present in the flower will obstruct the pollen from the anther of the same flower to go to the stigma of the same flower. By doing so, what will happen? The self-pollination will be restricted. Unisexuality, self-sterility, dichogamy, protandry, protogamy, heterostyly, hercogamy, these are the 5 conditions for sustainable cross-pollination, or these are the 5 conditions so as to restrict the self-pollination process. I think it is well understood for you people. Now, what are the advantages of cross-pollination? Cross-pollination advantages I am talking about. Since they are making lot of pollen grains, so there is maximum chance of pollination, first of all. Second, the flowers are very much bright, showy and attractive with full of nectar. Third one, the flowers whatsoever is produced due to cross-pollination are comprised of lot of nectaries, which is inviting insects and other organisms for the process of pollination. Now, what are the disadvantages? Disadvantages means lot of energy is required by the insects or by the flower to store their nectaries, because insect will come to suck the nectar, and at that time the pollen grain will be stick into the feet or into the mouth of the insect. But at the same time, if at all practically we are saying, so we can see that in disadvantages, the energy of the insects are wasted, first of all. Second, pollen grains are produced at a bulk, so there is a very less chances of pollination. So lot of pollen grain means lot of wastage, because only few pollen grains are required for pollination. Thirdly, parentage is not maintained. In self-pollination, the parentage was maintained, because same flower or different flower of the same plant. Here the parentage is not maintained. These are the disadvantages. But at the same time, cross-pollination is more advantageous than the self-pollination, because though the parentage is not maintained, but whatever the variety the cross-pollination is yielding is much better than the self-pollination. And that is the reason why there are varieties of fruits and seeds in cross-pollination as compared to that of the self-pollination. So these are a few amount of description on self and the cross-pollination. I hope you can understand this. Now, so next one is the agencies of pollination. Agencies of pollination. So there are few agencies. I have written here the names. Entomophily means insect pollinated. Anemophily means wind pollinated. Hydrophily, water pollinated. Ornithophily, birds pollinated, and chiropterophily is bats pollinated. Means here entomophily, the agency will be insect. Insect will transfer the pollen grain from male part to the female part, means from male flower to the female flower. And agencies are always required by the cross pollination. Agencies are not required by the self-pollination. They are always requirement of the cross-pollination, because self-pollination in the same flower, either the flower is bisexual, or if the flower is unisexual also, they are sharing the same plants, means male and female flower will be in the same plant or in the same tree. So that's the reason why the agencies are the requirement of the cross-pollination only. So in entomophily, the pollination is done by the insect. Here the agency is the insect. In anemophily, the agency is the wind. In hydrophily, the agency is the water. In ornithophily, birds. In chiropterophily is the bats. So one by one we will be discussing. So first of all, we'll be discussing about entomophily. So entomophily, what is entomophily? Entomophily means pollination by insect. Means insect will come to the male flower. It will take the pollen grain from the male flower and it will dust it into the female flower. So here the flower must be very much bright, showy and attractive. The flower must have lot of nectaries which could attract the insects. If the flower is not that much attractive or no nectar is present in the flower, then the insects won't be attracted. So flower must be, in characteristics of flower of entomophily, is the flower must be very much bright, showy and attractive. The petals of the flower will be much more colorful. Thirdly, the flower will have lot of nectaries, as well as the female part of the flower would be bit inside, so that when the insects will sit on the petals will be pressed down, and the prolonged proboscis of the insect, the proboscis of the insect means the tentacles of the insect, could go inside and could take the nectar. By doing so, what will happen? The pollen grain will be very smoothly sticked onto the feet of the insect, and now when the insect will sit to the female flower, those pollen grain will be dusted there. So this is how the entomophily takes place. Now next one is the anemophily. So in anemophily, what happens? Anemophily means wind pollinated. Here the flower need not look to be very much bright, showy or attractive. Rather, the anthers of the flower must be very much loosely attached to the filaments. Why? Because if the anthers are loosely attached, they will be more exposed to the external environment. Now when the wind will come, it will sweep away the pollen grains, and from the male part, the pollen grains will be taken to the female part. That is the charm of the wind pollination, that the anthers will be very much loosely attached to its filament, and the anther will be hanged out and exposed to the external environment. So when the wind will come, it will be carrying away the pollen grains and it will take to the female part of the flower. Now next one is hydrophily. Here what is the requirement? Hydrophily means water pollination. So example of entomophily, insect pollination, is jasmine, sunflower. These are the main examples of entomophily. Example of anemophily, maize, because their anthers are very nicely hanged outside, so that the wind could come and sweep away the pollen grains. Now hydrophily, here the pollen grains must be very much lightweight. The anther or the male flower which is producing the pollen grain must be very much light, so that it could float on the water. Now when it will touch the female flower, automatically it will fertilize the female flower. Why? Because the pollen grains are very much light, the pollen grains, so that it could float from the male flower to the female flower, and coming in contact with the female flower, it will fertilize the female flower. Example, Vallisneria hydrilla. Now next one is the ornithophily. Ornithophily means birds pollinated, pollination which are done by birds. Here what happens? The flower must be very much large. For example, the flower of the bombax and the silver oak, their flower is very much large, and when the birds like hummingbirds or else small birds like sparrow, when they will come for the nectaries, because their nectaries must be very much scented, as well as they must be producing at a bulk, because insect, they will take a small amount of nectaries, but birds, they need a lot of nectar for attraction. So the moment if the nectaries are present at a bulk, then automatically that flower will be very much scented and it will attract more birds. Now what happens when the birds will come? It will drink the nectar, it will take the nectar, and while doing so, again some amount of pollen grain will be stick into the feet as well as onto the beaks of the bird, on the feet as well as on the beaks of the bird. Now when that bird will fly and sit onto the other female flower, then but for sure the pollen grains will be dusted. But need to check one thing, that pollination will only take place into the same species. Means rose flower cannot pollinate marigold or sunflower. Sunflower cannot pollinate jasmine. The requirement of pollination is that it needs a similar species to pollinate. Now, so this is what happens in ornithophily. The best example of ornithophily is bombax as well as the silver oak. Now, next one is chiropterophily. Chiropterophily is bats pollinated. Pollination done by bats. We all know bats are nocturnal, means they are activated at night time. During the daytime they sleep. They are activated at night time. So the best example of bats pollinated is the baobab tree. Baobab tree is generally found in the north and the southern part of Africa. It is a big tree, as well as it is holding a lot of amount of water because it is not having any leaf to transpire. So the flowers of this baobab tree, what happens to these trees? Their flowers are very much big. And whenever the bats used to take rest on that tree, of course the nectars of these flowers are very much scented. It is attracting those bats. And during the night time, the bats will go and sit on the tree for some times, and then it will infiltrate into the flower so that it could take the nectaries. And finally, when it will go to the male flower of the same species of the baobab tree, then the fertilization will be taking place. So these are the agencies of the fertilization. These are the agencies of the fertilization due to which, pollinating agents, but fertilization is the next process of pollination. So we can also say that until and unless the agencies are not involved, neither pollination nor fertilization can occur. Pollination and fertilization, these are different things, but until and unless for the cross pollination, the agencies are not involved, for cross pollination cannot take place. So now what happens here is, these are the agencies. These agencies will transfer the pollen grains from a particular species, particular male species, to the particular female species specifically. Means rose male, then rose female, marigold male, marigold female. It doesn't mean that different species it will go and the pollination will be done. Never. That is not possible. So here the things are different. Means that entomophily, insect pollination will insect will go to the male part of the flower, will carry the pollen grain and transfer it to the female part of the flower. So here we need to make one concern, that pollination, again and again I am repeating the same thing, pollination is only done within the similar species. Different species cannot pollinate. That time the pollen grain will be non-functional. It cannot fertilize. So I think it is well understood. Go through the book, and if any doubts, please ask it. Go through the book properly and match it with the video. Of course, you will get to understand it. And if any doubts, please ask. Thanks a lot.